when this war is over, and one day it will be over, one way or the other, and most likely in a situation that is not favorable to Ukraine, I think we most people can agree with that. What's going to happen to a lot of these actors in Ukraine? And if they're not allowed to fight Russia anymore, who are they going to get mad at next? We had this whole thing in the 1980s called the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union, US arming and equipping them. Those guys ended up as the Taliban and Al Qaeda. What are we going to see come out of Ukraine at the end of the war? From the Azov battalion, from a bunch of different actors there who are mad, who are pissed, who have that kind of Freikorps syndrome, if you will, and maybe have international networks with certain foreign activists and whatnot. We're going to see some sketchy stuff. I don't begrudge Europeans for being Russia, Ukraine focused right now. If I was the country bordering those nations, I too would prioritize that over other issues. I just think it's ridiculous that so many people in Europe think that everyone outside of Europe has to prioritize this issue too. It would be like the equivalent of someone who lives in the Democratic Republic of Congo being like, well, why don't you prioritize Rwandan foreign policy? The narcissistic self-centeredness of the retirement community known as Europe can be extremely ridiculous, especially in a time when not since 1945 has this been the center of anything happening geopolitically. But
please like, share, and subscribe.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to another Class Unity event. Please like, share, subscribe, and make sure to let us know what you think in the comments. Also, consider joining Class Unity and making a donation today. Today, we will be discussing the topic of geopolitics and multipolarity, and we are very happy to be joined by Dr. Christopher Mott, who is a research fellow at the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, an international relations scholar focused on historical geopolitics, grand strategy, and the intersection of defensive realism and the conceptions of sovereignty in an era of increasing multipolarity. Previously, he was fellow at Defense Priorities in Washington, D.C., before that, researcher at the U.S. Department of State. He studied international relations at the University of St. Andrews, and his book, The Formless Empire, A Short History of Diplomacy and Warfare in Central Asia, concerns the rise of indigenous forms of geopolitical strategy on the Eurasian steppe. Today, we will be discussing his views on contemporary geopolitics and his thoughts about the ways in which the American empire has often clothed itself in the rhetoric of social justice to win consent for its objectives and make them more palatable to populations, especially his article, Woke Imperium, the coming confluence between social justice and neoconservatism. So thank you so much for joining us today, Chris. We're very happy to be able to talk to you. The way in which we usually have these conversations is to have our guest give a general presentation of the view we'll discuss, and then we'll go into questions. So could you please lay out your perspective on recent international political events? The way we discovered your work, by the way, was from your paper, Woke Imperium. So could you lay out your arguments there and how your thoughts may have developed since then?
yeah, sure. So I kind of came to the international relations field via history. I originally just wanted to be like a historian, a history academic, but I realized that maybe one day I can be that later, but like when things are changing rapidly, it's more useful and interesting to be involved, like as things are happening. Maybe it's a hope against all hope, but maybe one can have an influence on policy in a constructive manner. Who knows? And so I kind of pivoted when I was a grad student, and it was increasingly apparent to me that way before it was something that people talked about a lot, that multipolarity was here. Like in the post-recession world, always the unipolarity or the singular hegemonic dominance of the United States was always going to be temporary. There's no such thing as an end of history, or that this is now the point, and the world becomes united. That has never happened before, and it was never going to happen under the U.S. either. But it was increasingly apparent that the process of the kind of decline and fall of the attempt of like 90s style global hegemony was really coming to an end. I would say immediately after the recession, but picking up more and more with pace. Then you have basically kind of populist rebellions of all types in various countries. You have just an utter discrediting of nation building, of endless interventionism, etc. So when I finally entered the think tank world and started publishing stuff in a variety of places starting in 2019, more and more people were talking about this, but it was still kind of in a way that I think ignored the challenge of dealing with institutional inertia in the U.S. foreign policy establishment in particular, just how many people just go on autopilot. And even if everyone says, oh, yeah, we don't do like regime change wars anymore, do they really mean it? Or are they really going to put in the effort to stop the policies that keep those things going on? How many people are, making money off of massive defense spending, beltway bandits, and private contracting industry, etc. So all these things are kind of coming together. And while I was studying this, and also like very much consistently for years and years and years now, pushing back against people's kind of sloppy historical analogies, particularly when it comes to World War II and the Cold War. People trying to simplify all geopolitical events through those two lenses, and usually not through very accurate, even interpretations of those past events. But even setting that aside, just kind of ignoring that the present has its own dynamics, and just saying, oh, this is just like if you negotiate with X, Y, and Z, it's Neville Chamberlain, blah blah blah, like this type of sloppy nonsense. And while I was looking at that and pushing back at this, I was also looking at like what are the new weird permutations that the kind of the people who want global hegemony, what are they using to retain popular support, even if they just keep shedding it and they lose popularity. And there's multiple ways, of course, and we have ourselves have lived through it, and a basic knowledge of history will show many different permutations of kind of a selling imperial policies to people throughout time. But the one that really intrigued me at the end of the 2010s, and one that I had kind of subconsciously been following for a while, was this kind of turn towards progressivism as the excuse to use hyper interventionist rhetoric. And I had been kind of paying attention to this ever since I was in grad school and had yet to really publish anything aside from a few articles that no one ever read because they were in academic journals in the early 2010s. When it really hit me like, oh, this is going to be a thing. And it was the Coney 2012 movement, if you want to call it a movement, when there was this very concerted media and kind of cultural push with like both establishment media and kind of social justice campus activism to apprehend and try like the Ugandan warlord Joseph Kony for crimes against humanity, for his recruitment of child soldiers and for like all the horrific things that his army did. Now, this just happened to coincide, of course, with the massive expansion in AFRICOM, which is U.S. African Command, putting a lot of resources into building bases in Central Africa and the Sahel. So I'm sure that was just a coincidence. But either way, there was this very much like, oh, like Iraq was bad, but the Obama administration is different, and it's gonna go after people like this, and would show that we're not just targeting like Muslims, and it was like that was kind of to me the first like, oh, this is. I saw it as a premonition of the future. And then as the years kind of unfolded after that, you saw more and more of that type of rhetoric. It especially picked up around the Syrian civil war, the kind of concept of like Jeffersonian democratic moderate rebels, and the kind of the evils of the Assad regime. That was a kind of big, slow, in the background simmering thing. The attempt once again to use weapons of mass destruction claims, but very much tied with like how they had been used on civilian populations, ignoring who had motive to use them, of course, and who didn't. And then you saw, like, I think with the also the NGO complex, just in general, tends to be staffed by kind of professional managerial class people, people who are pretty centrist politically, but are very socially progressive. And I think anyone that's observed kind of the politics of the North Atlantic, the English-speaking world, knows that oftentimes the center is the most kind of warmongery side of any ideological spectrum in modern society. And also that a lot of people who have very centrist politics often jump onto performative trends to show that they're not just centrists when something becomes fashionable, particularly in social issues. So you have this kind of convergence of a lot of factors. And USAID, of course, no longer quite what it used to be because the new administration has kind of gutted it, really to put most of its operations under more direct control of the State Department. But USAID was always like a great example of this, right? You could follow the policies they supported in countries like Georgia. Georgia, of course, was a country that was just filled with foreign NGOs, like to a ridiculous degree. And sometimes they were opposed to each other. So you had this like incredibly fractious, unstable political system that would come about. And it was employing all these kind of educated progressive Westerners. So these issues and the fact that there were all kinds of weird stuff like George Floyd murals in Kabul, Afghanistan. There's just this very weird thing. And then when you look at all these examples and you put them together, it was increasingly obvious that like, oh, like these are the marks, these are the groups. These people are being taken for a ride in the same way that like evangelicals were used in the Bush administration to kind of like fight for Jesus or whatever against the heathen horde. And it was just, it's like a ping pong ball, right? In the two-party system. Whatever is trendy becomes the kind of new cause of imperial expansion. Now, I wrote Woke Imperium. I published it in the summer of 2022. So kind of like at the height of peak woke. And already then I knew it was like over. I was already like, this is probably, if I had published this any later, it wouldn't even be relevant in a sense. Like I feel like it almost came out of the door at the last thing because I was already feeling that that was all going away at that point. That people, the charm of the whole like militant social justice movement was over, and I was already thinking like, where is it going to go from here? Which is why I made a explicit point, even though I focused back then on the specific kind of progressive turn of interventionism. I made sure to start it with an introduction of all the examples in recent history of culture war being used to support interventionist foreign policy, most of which were right wing. So I started with, you know, like all these conservative examples, like how the Bush administration went to war against like abstinence only education in deciding who it funded in Africa and stuff like that, like really weird stuff. And to make sure that that was there, I talked about Victorian imperialism, which was both philosophically progressive, like elevating humanity, etc., as well as racist simultaneously. Talk about Woodrow Wilson, who was kind of like a, you know, the perfect example of that, the paternalist progressive, the kind of stern white father who hates all the brown people, but also knows what's best for them. You know, just draw. My whole argument was that the kind of woke phase of the Imperium was not any different from any of these things. The argument was continuity, not change. This was not some new thing that was changing anything. This is just the superficially left-wing version of the same stupid stuff that you have seen for centuries. And then in the conclusion, I predicted that it would end. You know, this too would be a phase. It would go away. There would probably be a new version of it. It might be centrist. It might be right wing. At that point, I wasn't quite sure what it would be. I threw out, I think, a few allusions to what it could be. Now I'm increasingly sure that my primary suspicion that it would be like a kind of Christian reactionary thing is probably correct. You know, the kind of J.D. Vance type rhetoric. But what we're seeing is always the importation of domestic culture war into foreign policy. And the point is to get a kind of middle class midwit demographic to who should know better supposedly to always be willing to be talked into these things, to always be willing to find media sympathy for whether it's regime change, nation building, sanctions, what have you. There's always a kind of nefarious other that like maybe the laws in your home country prevent you from really getting at the people that like you argue with online, but there's a version of those people abroad and you can really stick it to them, now. So that's kind of that was the main argument of Woke Imperium. That was, I would say, one of my more popular publications, certainly on the podcast circuit. It did strike a chord with a lot of people. I was afraid when it first dropped that only right-wing people would like it, which would kind of bury its message and make people think that I was writing like a partisan diatribe or whatever. But the opposite happened, actually. A lot of right-wing people didn't really like it because I made its comparisons with right-wing ideology explicit, I think was one of the reasons. And a lot of left-wing people did like it because I think they had noticed this trend in various forms of activism. They had seen people say, oh, like they had seen people adopt similar positions to establishment corporate media on a variety of foreign countries because there had been some kind of like weird distraction issue used, like, do you know like what Iranian domestic policy is like, you must be like conservative or right wing if you want to defend Iran from an external attack or something like that. So I think a lot of people had seen this type of like bait and switch enough that it was actually a lot of people in the left and with NGO experience really liked that paper. And I got a lot of really positive feedback from a more unexpected direction. But yeah, that was a few years ago. I haven't, although there's been a few follow-ups here and there, and I did write a piece earlier this year for the American Conservative warning about the right-wing version of this. In general, I've kind of more moved on since then towards like more structural forms of multipolarity, like how multipolarity is going to function, not just that it's happening, which now finally everyone agrees with us at IPD, but yes, it is happening, but like how specifically it's going to happen and like how it can be, yeah, it's dangerous too, but it can also be constructive if one is willing to kind of embrace the reality that no single country can dominate the planet anymore. But I think what even that, even moving in that direction, kind of away from this like overlap of domestic culture war thing I used to work on more, one thing that's still the same is that there's a lot of people that are psychologically unprepared because multipolarity isn't just like, oh, there's a bunch of different countries and none of them can dominate the world. It also means that there is no value setter, right? There is no country that gets to determine what is normal in the international system, which means that people that believe in some kind of universal morality or teleological path of progress are no matter what they believe are going to be very disappointed, I think, in this world because there isn't going to be a higher authority for them to say, well, let's determine what's right, what's ethical, what's good, because you're going to get five, six, seven, eight different powerful countries that are going their own way, and they're all going to have a different answer to that question. So I think attempts to kind of impose any form of moralism, the subjective moralism on the international system that is divorced from mutuality, respect, and sovereignty is going to fail miserably. And I think any ideology that has a missionary element to it, whether it be wokeness or religion or kind of militant humanitarianism, whatever it is, or racial supremacy. There's a lot of different types that seeks to impose itself on the rest of the world. That is intrinsically dangerous to diplomacy because there is no modus vivendi. There is no way for different countries with different values and systems to get along with each other. And that's the problem. And I think America has a centuries and centuries old puritanical evangelical kind of political culture that really struggles with that. And having seen that culture not just infiltrate the right, which we're all used to from like the days of the moral majority, but to infiltrate the left as well, to infiltrate the opposition, and above all, I think these days to infiltrate the center, right? The center who believes in the kind of neoliberal experiment, which is the closest that an ideology ever came to dominating the world. Still failed, but it probably the closest it did to have that much global penetration. Are our elites able to adapt to this? Are they able to understand that like what's good for America, whoever, whatever section of America you're talking about, maybe shouldn't be exported to the rest of the world. Maybe it's time to be a more normal country again and to understand that it has limits before it gets overextended. And I think it's really hard for people to adapt to that reality. And so a strategic cultural shift does need to occur on some level.
Thank you. We'll go into questions. If anybody has a question, feel free to drop it, write it in the chat or go on Stack. I just, for our first question, we'll get into the meat of things pretty quickly, but just maybe as a first question, Chris, for members here or people in our audience who are relatively new to discussions about political realism and geopolitics, who are interested to hear how you understand these terms, maybe a few terms, not we don't you don't have to give us the one-on-one, but so for example, you mentioned multipolarity just now, and that's a term that's in big in discussions these days, and sometimes people mean different things. And I think you basically described what you mean by that term. If you have anything to add to that, feel free. Uh, Terms like neoconservatism, neoliberalism, the context of international relations, political realism. Maybe one question I can ask is, what kind of view of politics does the American political establishment seem to express? Is there one view, or are there many potentially conflicting views? And how might a consensus inform its actions?
Yeah, that's a good question. I think there's many different views. There is no consensus really, except around a few issues. Um, and it's where those issues overlap that I think you kind of see the truth as to what the establishment really values. So there are definitely, I would say, people in the political establishment that are riding the gravy train, right? So that's like the defense contractors, the people making money off of this, the kind of the politicians that have built their brand on being like a certain type of hawk, or whatnot. Like that's there. There's the self-interested people in their own way. They are realists, if not in an international relations sense, but they are in the sense that they are self-interested actors, and it is pretty obvious that they are. That's a big part of it, of course, and a lot of lobbying is connected to that. And the other part is that I kind of alluded to before, the kind of institutional inertia is that it's really hard to change bureaucracies. They just kind of go on forward momentum. They just kind of fall forward, slumping until they run out of steam. So change is slow. That's a part of it. But I think the thing that keeps those two things working together, the kind of lubricant for getting in the way of dealing with the real world as it really is ideology. I'm not one of those people that thinks that ideology is the most important thing in policy. I tend to take a materialist stance first, but I can't discount it either. It's very much there, and it very much is what keeps the various factions who might disagree with each other on a lot of issues working together. And that ideology shows where the overlap points are. It is They might disagree on why there should be American hegemony, but they often agree that there should be American hegemony. They might disagree on the specific nuances of this and that in Middle East policy, but boy, are they all pro-Israel. So there's like certain things that are just, there. And the ideology is what kind of keeps those points kind of connected between these things. Now, if you had asked me before I don't live in DC anymore, but I used to once I got out of university. If you had asked me before I moved there and worked there, what percentage of people are like the cynical operators versus like the kind of like inertia true believers, I would have said, oh, it's definitely more cynical operators. But having lived there, there's more of the true believers than you think. I'm not saying it's the overwhelming majority, but it's enough that this is actually quite relevant, which is why I think it is important to kind of critically interrogate these worldviews. So yeah, I mean, it depends on what level too, but like in the mid-level, in the kind of people that are getting promoted that will be high level soon, but maybe aren't yet, I think this kind of America as the indispensable nation view is actually very high. Something that, and I don't want to disturb people too much here, but this is something I observed when I was there, is that there's a really high percentage of West Wing fans that live in DC. And so you get a lot of people, disproportionately people that kind of come from far away from DC and the Northeast. I know the stereotype is a lot of these people, they all live in this area, but like, no, I think to me, it's kind of like a bit of misfit nerds who maybe like live in like a Midwestern state or something, and then they get really into civics, and then they watch like the newsroom and the West Wing, and they're like, I'm gonna move to DC and I'm gonna have a walk and talk in the halls of power, and we're gonna work on we're gonna get things done, trademark symbol. And like that is not a unfortunately, that is a larger percentage of the people that like that we often call, lanyards, that live in DC. Like that's some of them are like that, okay? So it needs to be that needs to be understood. Now, those people are capable of changing their minds. I think we have seen over the course of time, especially after Trump's fairly decisive reelection, or whatever you want to call that, maybe not a reelection, but return to power. Like a lot, I've seen some of these people be like, maybe we should rethink our trade, our views on trade or whatnot. But like, it's always, they'll give concessions here and there, but they're never going to give up the game on like the core things, which is, effectively, because it's self-flattering, it's like a protagonist thing, that they are the moral arbiters of America and America is the moral arbiter of the world. And so it's hard to displace that centrality of, and of course, the cynical actors, the people with the money, the lobbyists and whatnot. These are easy marks for them, right? So it's easy to say like, oh, you're not just taking money, because what is lobbying but legalized corruption after all? But like, you're not just taking money, like you're doing the right thing. We're just facilitating it. And so I think that, I mean, this is a bit of a meandering answer, sorry, but like your main point is like how much do these people differ in how they get along? I think that there's actually plenty of differences here, but the key thing to look at is the similarities, because that's where you see like what is the glue holding them together. And I would contend that the glue holding them together is a kind of general worldview based around hegemony. But it's not hegemony as a big, bad, scary empire. I mean, for some people it is. Like for John Bolton, who I would not classify as a neoconservative, actually, because John Bolton does not care about the development model of a foreign country. He just wants to watch people burn on TV. Like his whole thing is like to get off on war. Like that's also a faction, right? These people are different. The human rights activists and John Bolton, they don't have a lot of similarities, but they do want the US to be able to penetrate whatever sovereign nation that it wants to in order to be the dominant factor. So, there's this weird commonality there, whatever other disagreements they have. When you look at terms like neoconservative and liberal internationalists, they are technically two different things. But practically speaking, they support the same policies: massive defense spending, bases around the world, permanent alliances, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the liberal internationalists will couch in terms of the UN Declaration of Human Rights, that maybe democratic peace theory, which is something I absolutely despise because it's historically untrue. But leaving that aside, they have that certain thing. The neoconservative says that you can bring about these positive things, but ignore the UN part. You do it through the will and the raw power of the US military, which in a weird way, because I'm normally primarily opposed to neoconservatives, it's weird to say this, but is actually like a more honest worldview, because like American predominance on the world stage does not come from values ultimately, even if it's upheld internally through them. It comes through power. And so the neoconservatism movement is actually a bit more mature and a bit more honest in this way. But in the end, they want the same thing. Like, there is no, to me, there is no real practical difference between Samantha Power and John Bolton, even if philosophically they are very different from each other.
Okay, let me make sure I'm understanding you. So it seems like, okay, on neoconservatism is just the right wing, maybe Republican side of American hegemony, and the liberal internationalists is maybe just the Democratic. Maybe that's a simplification, but the differences are in the difference are the differences in the means by which they advocate a America pursue American hegemony, the UN versus, I don't know, raw military power, and differences in ideological justification. Different arguments, in other words, but they're arguments for the same thing. So they're, of course,
Yeah.
functionally going to be the same.
Well, look at all the things they support. They both of these factions supported Iraq, Libya, Syria, Yemen, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Ukraine, like, go on and on and on. Um, the they always end up supporting the same policies. You just get to see different, different cultural takes, which appeal to different domestic audiences. And so the kind of NPR and the Fox News people who view each other as enemies and probably are on a lot of domestic issues oftentimes end up having the same views when it comes to foreign countries, when it comes to grand strategy, and when it comes to the US role in the world. And I kind of think that part of that is just the machine running as intended. And another part of that is that's almost the point in a way, right? Like, culture war serves as the kind of distracting bauble to make people feel that they have a choice. And then when it comes down to these issues of like real power, money and power, which are economic and foreign policy, then you see that you perhaps have a bit less choice than you were initially led to believe when you look at the culture war that makes it look like these people are so different. And I think foreign policy in particular really shows this because I mean, if you were to ask me, like, what's a left-wing foreign policy, what's a right-wing foreign policy, I couldn't answer that question. Um, I could say right now there's an establishment versus anti-establishment foreign policy. I could say there's a realist versus liberal versus constructivist versus whatever foreign policy. But to put it in kind of the terms we talk about domestic policy is very, very difficult because there is not a huge separation between the options we have. And there are a variety of different things, but they're either not allowed to talk about them or they're written off as crackpottery, right? So yeah, I mean, like, your average international relations undergraduate, and I have plenty of problems with how universities teach international relations, mind you, but I think your average international relations undergraduate has a better understanding than your average just news consumer, because your average news consumer is affected by like reverse partisanship. So if they see something maybe that they would support by one party, but a person of the other party does it, now all of a sudden they're against it. It just kind of creates this incoherent mess. I mean, I've with people that, and I don't expect people to know about foreign policy. Your average person doesn't. I'm not saying everyone should necessarily, but when people opine on these things, I know when I'm talking to someone who is like a partisan for either of the two major political parties, um, because they have the worst takes imaginable. And it doesn't matter which party they support. It's just that they're bought into that framework, right? Like, what is the Democrat policy? What is the Republican Party? Or what is the Tory versus Labor policy, or what have you? It's just, I mean, that's just not what's happening. Like, when we talk about foreign policy, like in the policy world, it's really like, how do you conceptualize interest for who? What is a national versus international interest? What is the point of diplomacy? Like, these questions do not slide into the domestic concept of policy, and yet that is how it's talked about, and that is why it is useful to insert these kind of culture war coded foreign policy propaganda, whether it's like progressive NGOs pushing like, oh, did you know Cuba is racist or whatever, this kind of thing, or it's like kind of evangelical missionaries abroad who are like, we're being persecuted, or we need and they of course, that's a community that has a long history of working with the CIA in many parts of the world. So the way of distracting from this is to give it a culture war coding. But the culture war coding is really just to get more people on board with interventionism, is my thesis.
Yeah, we have a comment. So there is no old left foreign policy conception. I'm not sure what you mean by that, Daniel, but maybe anti-imperialist. There's no anti-imperialist um, foreign policy conception in Washington. One thing I wanted to ask Chris, just to separate um, ideology can be a view of the way things are and a view of the way they should be. And I my understanding is political realism is a view of the way things are, of how nations act as self-interested actors, and the rhetoric around social justice, wokeness, things like that, largely a view of the way things should be. But is that the way you're seeing it, or is there a conception of wokeness or liberalism that runs counter to realism as a way of seeing things, seeing the way things are?
Yeah, it depends on how you want to like approach that. I think everyone, even someone like me who's like a diehard realist, everyone has a concept of what the world should be, right? I think it'd be weird to deny that. I just think it's a question of how much of it impacts your ability to look at what it is. Like, can you set it aside, or can you put the what is ahead of what should be? Um, and you can, realism is a tactic more than a worldview in a sense. You can be like these days, realism is coded as anti-hawk because it's anti-neoconservative and it's anti-liberal internationalist. And those are the two biggest hawks in the United States. But you can be a realist hawk, of course you can. A lot of even very like restrainers are hawkish on China because China is the only country that actually poses a real conventional challenge to the United States right now, at the global level anyway. Plenty of places do in a regional way, but they're China hawk realists. There are just hawk realists in general. There are realists that say like big, powerful military always good, which is, a part historically of realism. Like no realist would ever be for getting rid of the military. Um, so it is more of a tactic, and it's really like how you want to negotiate with other people, I would say. So like a realist knows that other people will be different and have different interests. Therefore, there are no universal values to a realist. In a sense, a realist is actually a way better at being postmodern than a postmodernist is, because I think we know from experience that postmodernists claim to be for relativity of values, but they're very easily fall for these kind of like missionary worldviews of like remaking the world through social construction and making everything better. But the realist just accepts that people are different, even if it's in a weird way, a baffling way, and says like, well, we should be able to negotiate with anyone. We should be able to be allies or rivals of anyone, regardless of what our domestic policies are, because ultimately this is a question of either a shared mutual interest or a lack of mutual interest. And I think that with that is implicitly the understanding that nothing is permanent. So, a friendship here might not last forever. In fact, probably won't. There are very few very long-term alliances in world history. Like the Anglo-Portuguese alliance is like super, super, super old. We're talking like 400 years old, but that is an outlier. Okay, that like that's an extreme outlier. Usually people's relationships last like 10 to 40 years, and they kind of go up and go down, and things inevitably change. And something that I've done, I've actually really pivoted in recent years towards doing a lot of research, some work, and hopefully more in the future on the kind of foreign policy perspectives of the early American Republic. And I think it's a really interesting example of a country that was very much founded, like, arguably the first country that was explicitly founded as a liberal country, right? It has a constitution. There's Enlightenment philosophers being cited all over the place, influencing people in a variety of ways. You got the Bill of Rights. This is like the first explicitly by intention liberal country. And yet, its early days in foreign policy had nothing to do with that. There was clearly a very, very strict separation between domestic politics and foreign policy, implicit in the kind of like construction of the US. And so to me, that's really interesting because like the US was never more realist than when it was explicitly a kind of almost idealist shot in the dark as a founding political experiment. And that's because it was a young, fragile country. It didn't have the luxury of being able to assume that everyone would get along if they all shared the same values. Our first friends were the absolute monarchy of France and the absolute monarchy of Morocco. And then the kind of mixed constitutional monarchy of Britain was our first enemy. Then France had a revolution. And at first, we were like, welcome to the club, boys. There was a lot of Francophilia, more Francophilia in the 1790s, by the way, than there probably is love of Israel today, like extreme levels on both sides of the Atlantic between France and America in the 1790s, and our relationships broke down almost immediately. Our policies began to diverge almost immediately. There was very little in the end. You can only get a couple years of solidarity between the two young republics because France wanted as many allies as it could to fight Britain, and the U.S. could not afford another war and didn't want one. The whole point was to get out of having to fight endless global wars at the behest of European powers. So we actually, it wasn't declared, but our first military operations against a European state were against France. And they were in the Adams administration. And we fought an undeclared naval war with France because they were preying on our shipping. Because if we wouldn't join them fighting Britain, then they would seize profit from our extremely successful shipping industry to offset the costs of fighting Britain themselves. And so we had to actually build the US Navy to fight people who had just been our allies a few years before. And so this is the reason I don't believe in democratic peace theory, by the way. But there's other examples of this type of stuff too. I mean, you can go back to ancient Greece. The democracies did not get along with each other simply because they were democracies. Two democracies could be the most diehard enemies in the world. I think if you really want to differentiate realism from anything, it's the de-emphasis on domestic policy creating long form alliances, and just understanding that geopolitical interest will usually override those concerns, regardless of what similarities two countries have. I think the reason this gets swept under the rug is because since World War II, we've had a lot of stability in Europe, which is rare because it's Europe, under the American security umbrella. But I would point out as an example, like what country in Europe is remotely as powerful as the United States? Those aren't partners. Those are vassals. They are getting their orders and they are oftentimes obeying them. That's why it works. Democratic peace theory in the modern North Atlantic is part of global empire. It is not because they're democracies and therefore they intrinsically get along. We have many of these unequal partnerships with non-democracies, and they also tend to obey us. So I don't really see that as being a thing. I think you could have a fully democratic country, but if it was remotely as powerful as the US and that country would probably clash over stuff all the time. So whether it's alliance networks or resources, spheres of influence, what have you. And this isn't unique to liberalism. I mean, an example of this, of geopolitics kind of strong arming over onto domestic policy has happened in other forms of government too. The Sino-Soviet split being an obvious example in the 1960s in the communist world. So, and Yugoslavia before that. I think when I hear people say things like that, I think like, well, why didn't all the absolute monarchies of the 17th century all get along with each other, right? Like they fought each other all the time because in the end it was irrelevant that they were all absolute monarchies. What mattered was if they were rivals or not. So the ultimate question is, how much do you want this rivalry to be military and how much would you rather it be more restrained and diplomatic? And the once again, when having conversations like this, it's really hard for me to code it in the left-right way once you get to this, because this country and that country, even within two different countries that have a similar style of political system, what is left and what is right can be very different in those countries, right? Like, I would say without I think it's pretty obvious that like the American right wing is actually very, very different from a lot of right wing movements in other countries, even kind of more culturally compatible ones like Europe. Like the French right is nothing like the American right, and their interests are very different. So, yeah, to me,
We do have
location
a
is
couple questions about the right. Well, specifically the socially conservative American nationalists, or the national conservatives. Do they have their own policy worldview, or I mean, are they relevant? It seemed for a second like they might have some influence through the Trump administration. What happened there?
trying to figure out who's predominant influence in the Trump administration is like really hard. Whoever flatters him the most at any given point, until the next person walks in the room and flatters him better. It's really hard to say. Everything is so transactional with Trump, but also very like in a very like not consistent way at all. The National Conservatives have much more influence now than they used to. But would I say that they're dominant at all, or like, no, not really. I think there's a weird halfway point between the National Conservatives and the old Neoconservatives, which is that like people that reject nation building but do not reject interventionism. And in a weird way, they have kind of discovered the right wing version of like Clinton style like bombing by virtue signal, or where there's just like, oh, we'll show how tough we are, but it's like for media coverage. It's very weird. I mean, when I look back at Trump's first term and when he bombed Syria, based off of probably faulty intelligence, but that's all he did. He dropped a bunch of bombs on some Syrian air bases. What was that exactly? Like, it's kind of hard to say. And now, Trump number two, you have this really interesting situation where Marco Rubio basically controls the entire foreign policy establishment. He is National Security Advisor, Secretary of State, controls the old, dismembered bits of USAID, probably has disproportionate influence in whispering in Trump's ear. Trump does understand that his constituency as a whole is increasingly anti-interventionist. And so he has certain good instincts that pull him back from things other presidents would jump into, usually too late. Like he'll go and do something like in Iran, but then kind of pull back. Very weird. But he has this guy in his government who is very much an interventionist. And I kind of wonder if there's a weird deal there. I mean, I have no evidence one way or the other, but I think that there's kind of like a Rubio has to lay off, proportionally speaking, not enough in my opinion, but proportionally speaking, he has to lay off the Middle East and Ukraine compared to where he used to be. And in exchange, he has given Cuba and Venezuela, um, which is his life's goal, right? His regime change in Venezuela. I, it's hard to read that though. I mean, like, I don't know. Like, I get whenever something happens with the Trump administration, I just ask, okay, like, who was hanging out with them last?
Yeah, and
Because
Daniel, is your question about the Trump administration?
Well, not exactly, but it is about, I guess it does relate in the respect that it's about the interest groups behind these various tendencies, I guess. One really interesting comment that you made uh, a bit ago was about how your view is materialist and not ideologically based. And so, I mean, my question, I guess, is about this topic of different groups and different views, but also, I guess, about realism. So, I mean, realists tend to claim or think about the actors on the geopolitical stage in terms of as though they were like single units, black boxes, billiard balls, like John Mearsheimer always says. And they say that the nations act in their own rational interests, and the ends justify the means and all of the sort of standard power talk, which I don't object to. That's not the issue. I really appreciate the warning against wishful thinking and all the damage that can cause. But my question is about, the unit of analysis, because what we're getting into here is how there are so many different groups going on, and presumably, these aren't just opinions suspended in a void. These are specific people with specific positions in certain relations with certain interests, vying for power and so forth. And so, it just seems like nations need to be disaggregated into classes according to wealth and power. And now this isn't a plea for a sort of normative left-wing perspective. Presumably, if you're a conservative or a right winger or anything, and you care about the facts, this should matter. And presumably everyone tacitly accepts it anyways. But, poor people don't set national policy, and, nation states actions, the state actions tend to serve the interests of wealthy asset owners, not working poor people. I mean, this is just trivially true. So, I was wondering, what do you think about the topic of class and economics as it relates to geopolitics? On the one hand, the interest groups, I guess the empirical question about the groups out there, who are the interest groups? Why is the state doing this rather than that, and so forth? But then also a kind of methodological question, I guess, about um, the theory we use to understand this about realism specifically. It seems to me one of the massive deficits or weaknesses of realism, and I love realism, is that it does not disaggregate nations into the classes that it consists of, so that it can actually look specifically who are the actors, who are the interests. It's not, for instance, I'll just give you an example. Oftentimes you hear people talk about the strong dollar and the dollar being the global reserve currency, and that's in our interest. Well, whose interest is it in, actually? It's in the interest of creditors. It's not in the interest of people who would be making cars for export, for manufacture, to have an overvalued dollar. It's in the interest of asset owners who have financial assets which are denominated in that currency. And so, devaluing the dollar can be very good for the vast majority of people. And so, whenever we hear these things, the interests, the national interest, we always have to think who. And so I just wonder what do you think about that, about realism, and then how can we inform our view of the vying groups?
That's a great question. I actually really love this question, and it usually comes up when I'm talking to left-wing people, and I'm always happy to deal with it because, like, I mean, I actually share a lot of the criticisms of realism you just said, and I am a realist. But the thing is, there's multiple kinds of realists, right? So right now, and for most of my life, the dominant strand of realism has been neo-realism, of which John Mearsheimer is the kind of high prophet, right? Now, I view it as a net win that Mearsheimer went from someone only IR majors have heard of to someone that a lot of people have heard of because it has helped make the conversation more honest and it has helped bring out some issues that were neglected before, and I think that's great. But I'm not a neo-realist, and I have my problems with neo-realism. And a big one of them is the fact that it almost entirely ignores domestic politics. Now, for me, my critique of kind of more idealist thinking that I mentioned before, the assumption that countries will get along because they have similar systems, that's incredibly important, and I hold to that quite stridently. But that is not the same thing as saying that countries don't have internal dynamics in their own systems, and a constant debate about what the national interest is. And which is why I think more people should have the discussion, what is the national interest? And I don't think there's a concrete answer to that because the national interest is basically, in effect, whatever class rules society gets to determine the national interest. This is how domestic politics impact foreign policy. The kind of realist that I'm most aligned to is called neoclassical realism, which is much more pulling from the old school realists. Like we're talking really old school here, like pre-E.H. Carr. We're talking like Machiavelli, where we're talking like we're talking like Chinese legalism. We're talking about Kautilya from ancient India, one of my personal favorites. none of these people separated domestic and foreign policy ever, like except to say that there are different rules for it. Because like the key separation is that in domestic policy, you have an ultimate authority, right? You have a kind of Leviathan, to use a Hobbesian term. You have you have a mommy or a daddy in which to appeal to. That is like what we would call the federal government, but uh, whatever. That doesn't exist in international policy. So that's the difference. But in terms of domestic policy and foreign policy bleeding into each other, oh yes, absolutely, absolutely. Um, and I think that like the key question when you have a foreign policy debate in domestic politics during an election cycle or whatever is who gets to determine what the national interest is, or who gets to be the primary class that determines like how we conceptualize how we conduct foreign policy. Now, obviously, the well-moneyed class is overwhelmingly disproportionately influential in this. And therefore, whether it's liberal or realist or something in between or something else entirely, under present conditions, under most conditions in history, large corporations have an enormous thumb on the scale of how foreign policy is conducted. And this, obviously, if you hear him talk about it, this is definitely, I think, Mearsheimer's biggest blind spot is that he can even acknowledge this to some extent, but he says ultimately it gets overridden. But I think that that kind of ignores just how influential these economic actors are, particularly in times when corruption is high and faith in the system is low, and people kind of want to, ride the gravy train and cash out. So there's a pay to play element there. It can't be ignored. And so I think everything you said is basically correct. I'm not I'm not going to dispute that. I think that's why I have strong views on domestic politics. It's not part of my professional profile so much, but I do because I would rather our concept of national interest be targeted towards the average citizen and not, GlaxoSmithKline and Halliburton and whoever else, right? Like, those people, their concept of a national interest isn't mine. My concept is, how livable is this country? How livable is this world? How viable is diplomacy over warfare whenever possible? Can we defend the homeland? Yes, sure, but also can we make sure that we're not picking fights we don't need to? And do we understand that we have such a favorable geographic situation that we could, under a smarter foreign policy, that with a smarter grand strategy, cut the defense budget so that we didn't have to run skyrocketing deficits and leave so many things, starving, crumbling infrastructure, et cetera. I think a better foreign policy, and this goes the other way too, right? Foreign policy impacts domestic policy. A better foreign policy would mean that we would have higher living standards at home. So these things absolutely go back and forth. I mean, in some ways, in very visceral ways too. I mean, I'm sure
Right.
most of you here have heard of Seth Harp's recent book on the Fort Bragg cartel. But if you haven't, you should check it out. It's really good. It's actually a topic I've been following myself in the background for a long time. I have a very long delayed piece that needs to come out soon. Hopefully will about this topic, but not anywhere in detail as this book, but it's about how the global war on terror and these small shadow wars that are deniably not real wars, quote unquote, create these kind of like ignored, psychologically disturbed, like traumatized veterans that then come home and they use their international connections to either set up drug smuggling networks or to engage in like violent criminal activity or to carry forth like the abuse that they suffered from the military into like their families. And so there's always this, and just look at like the demographics of like mass shooters and stuff like that, disproportionate amount of combat veterans. So there's
Right.
absolutely a back and forth between domestic and foreign policy, always, always, always. I think the key difference is, and the one that I uphold as a key difference, is that in a functioning state, you have an ultimate authority, which is the state. In the international realm, you do not have that authority, and that is what keeps there from being any kind of like laws, like actually enforceable laws across the board in the international realm, the way that there are in domestic policy. That's a key difference. But outside of that, yeah, they link back and forth. And
Right.
neoclassical realism, which I'm much more into myself, actually kind of elevates domestic policy. It elevates domestic policy as it does. They are realists, so in the end, it's the territorial unit is gonna assert itself. Its interest will assert itself over any domestic changes, but it it's all about how those interests are debated and discussed between rational actors within the state. That's an important part of neoclassical realism, which is why it does not ignore domestic policy. And I
And
think
we have a
this
couple
effect,
more. Oh, finish your thought. Just go ahead.
yeah,
Go
yeah,
ahead.
just really quick. This effect is really, really exaggerated if you are a great power slash a kind of big empire, right? Because then you have a bunch of special interest groups, not just from your own citizens, but foreign citizens as well, who see you as the ticket for their faction in their country getting domestically above another. See the recent Nobel Prize winner definitely being a kind of she cares about Venezuelan domestic politics. She wants to use U.S. foreign policy to make sure that her domestic faction is in charge there. That would be an example of that. The Israel lobby is obviously another example of that. So,
Yeah, and we want to get to the topic of the different big conflicts like the Ukraine conflict, the issue in Israel. But just a couple last questions on the theoretical questions. So I'll take a follow up from Daniel and then Martin.
Yeah, okay, thanks. So it sounds like you're simpatico with the, let's call it the old left perspective, before the new left, before it became identitarian, cultural, anything but class type leftism on the descriptive side. So there are these classes we have to disaggregate somehow, these black boxes, to see who's actually doing the doing, and who's to quote Ben Carson, and who's actually and whose interests. On the normative side, it sounds like you're also sort of sympathetic to a class-based view, the old left view, namely, like, is it really in the interest if the nation is all the people who live there, is it really in their interest? The nation's interest is good because it's just the people, right?
Mhm.
That I also quite like. So it sounds like you think realism could learn a lot from maybe this old left style class perspective, at least in those respects. Well, I'm wondering now, just to follow up. What do you think contemporary leftists could learn from realism? Is there something that you wish that, like, if they would really take to heart, whether it's left liberals or the sort of attention-getting campus protest crowds or anything that pass? Because the left in America is very different than, as you said, the right's different everywhere, the left's different everywhere. American leftism is its own sort of weird brand, weird sauce. So, is there anything you think, like, dear leftists, please take this lesson from realism? What would it be?
Yeah, I definitely do. There's a reason why I think most people that have read my work and don't haven't interacted with me outside what I published assume I'm paleo-conservative because I kind of come across I'm almost I mean I'm not sympathetic to their cultural project, but I'm sympathetic to them in a lot of issues, just like I'm sympathetic to the old left. And I think the big reason that people think that is because the one very strong critique I have of the left um, it comes across very paleocon coded, and that is there is no right side of history. And I feel strongly enough about this that I wrote a whole article. I think it's literally titled "There is no right side of history." History is determined. It's a bit simplistic to say it's determined by the victors because anyone who's studied Central Asian history knows that the nomadic empires were all written by people that they conquered, which is why they get really bad press. So it's not always true, but uh, policy is made by the victors, and victory is always temporary. Great powers are temporary, which means values are temporary. There is no telos in history. There is the end of history that we make fun of. Liberals for naively believing in, the Fukuyama, everything comes to an end. I think there's a strain of that in leftism too. And it's a bit hypocritical to make fun of the liberals and say, but oh, if we did it socialistically, it would be this, then we would get the real end of history. And there is no end of history. Empires go up, they go down. Cultures rise and then they disappear. History is not progressive. The question is, how do you increase living standards here and now, knowing that you probably won't increase them permanently? There is no guarantee of a greater glorious future, no matter what Platonic model of ideology you claim to be following. The chaos of events, random things, the environment itself, They all have a say. There's so many actors that have a say in everything, many of them unconsciously and without intent, that I just, on a philosophical perspective, I don't mean this in a political faction way, but in the philosophical perspective, I reject the progressive view of history entirely. I think it is false. It is a faith-based worldview. And I think in the end, everything crumbles and everything dies, but then is replaced by other totally different things, which may be better, may be worse. You don't know. No one knows until it happens. And so I think that the thing that leftists could learn from realists is the idea of not short-term planning, because that's a bit, that's like erratic Trump policy or whatever. Yeah, but medium-term planning, right? Not like what's the world going to look like 100 years? We don't know. No one knows. There's a reason we look back on people's old predictions and laugh at them, right? Because they're always so off. We are not going to know. But one thing I can guarantee you is that there is no utopia. The struggle of existence will always be a morally gray place. And I think this is the thing that realism really gets. And I would like a lot of the left and frankly factions of the right too, especially the religious right, though they're probably hopeless, but to recognize this, right? That there is no end times, if you will. There is just an endless kind of process that is not progressive. It is, nor is it perfectly cyclical because nothing repeats itself, of course, but it is more cyclical than it is progressive. You see certain patterns when you look at, I mean, just read, not to say he was right about everything, but just read Edward Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire because he's an entertaining and fun author. But also, like, it's interesting to see someone at the height of British imperialism, at least the start of it, grappling with like the death of Rome, and then you grapple with him in turn, and you kind of see like, oh, it's interesting. Like some of these patterns, they do repeat over and over again, no matter how much the technology changes, just because. And I admit, probably the most important intellectual in my worldview is Ibn Khaldun, who is the kind of the ultimate cyclic figure. And Ibn Khaldun is interesting because he actually is a great overlap of realism and leftism, if you think about it, because his whole worldview was that kind of nomadic people rose because they were more egalitarian and therefore they were more successful. That gave them a competitive advantage. They had solidarity. It was called asabiya in Arabic, but like it means effectively solidarity. That was like the winners. It wasn't because of social justice reasons, it's because it made them stronger. Egalitarianism makes society stronger, but then the egalitarian ruling elite, which founded the state, becomes decadent. It becomes less egalitarian. If it's successful, it'll become so wealthy that the class divide will become huge. Then the solidarity dissipates, and then the society gets weaker, and then a new group of people arises that has more solidarity and is more egalitarian. They topple the old formerly egalitarian rulers and restart the process over again. This jives with my worldview from reading history pretty well, I would say. I think that, and that is, you could say that is compatible with leftism, but it's a non-progressive leftism. It was a kind of cyclical, I mean, philosophically conservative, but politically, you could call it very socialistic worldview. And I would say that, in a lot of the history I've read from different parts of the world, it jives pretty well. A new ruling elite usually has a greater sense of self solidarity or comes from a class background that has a solidarity that the one it replaces did not. But then in time, the same forces will impact it and the cycle will repeat.
We want to ask you about a few of the things, current events. To get your, oh yeah, Martin, go ahead.
Sorry, yeah, just a question that sort of fits naturally there, I think. First, just a quick aside, which is that I've heard you say that you like John Gray's work, and so I think I recognized a theme there, right? I think I've seen him saying, attacking the idea that history is necessarily sort of, does he call it meliorative or something?
Yeah, melioristic, I think. Yeah.
Yeah, melioristic, right, as an article of faith. Anyway, sorry. So the question I wanted to ask was, I was originally thinking of asking just, do you think there's any? It's clear that I take it, if I understand you, that you think that both kind of material factors and ideological factors play a role in determining foreign policy. And I was originally thinking, maybe I'd just ask, do you think anything useful can be said at a general level about about the relative weighting of those two. But then you said some things earlier on about how they kind of perhaps interact or connect to each other. And so I wanted to, so a sort of variant of this that occurred to me was, do you think that anything useful can be said at a fairly general level about how that relative weighting varies from one nation to another? Perhaps depending on, say, the level of economic development or the kind of political structures that are in place. And just in a kind of armchair way, for example, one might wonder if uh, there needs to be more weight on ideology needs to do more work in a liberal democracy because the politician, or a liberal democracy, quote unquote, because the politicians need to get the vote, need to work harder to maintain legitimacy, say, than in some kind of, again, dictatorship, supposing that we can make out those distinctions in some straightforward way. Does that make sense?
Oh yeah, absolutely. No, I think that that's a good thing to pick up on. I think it's pretty simple actually. Like the more precarious a country's existence is, especially its sovereignty, the less ideological it can afford to be. So a country that is small, that is threatened by its neighbors, just has to be cannot afford ideology. Ideology is almost like in foreign policy, it's almost like a luxury good in a sense. The more secure you are and the more wealth you have to throw around, the more you can engage with it. And the less you have, or the more, especially security situation, the more you're going to disregard it. So, like Finland in the Cold War, right? Finland had to placate the Soviet Union after World War II, but they got to keep their domestic autonomy and sovereignty because they played ball as a junior partner of the Soviet Union. There's no ideological consistency to that whatsoever. That's pure survival. You got to do it. If you want to remain as a sovereign country, you got to do it. And that is what I think that is what countries do when they're under threat. The stronger they get, the more they can be like, oh, we should legitimize like how much influence we have over other people. So like you can kind of see this like in the evolution of modern Turkey, right? Early on, the Turkish Republic was just like the most mercenary actor in the world. It very much had a strong domestic ideology, very much. In fact, I recently published a book chapter where I talk about it like a lot and what that role had in like constructing the state's view of itself. But it played in terms of foreign policy, it played with everyone. It was recovering from World War One. It was really precarious. Even in the Cold War, when it was solidly aligned with NATO, it was still very much like it was all about maintaining security to the straits. It had nothing to do with East versus West or anything like that. It was the Soviet Union was strong and it was close. U.S. was far, therefore it was less threatening. But ever since, in the past few years, Turkey's had a much stronger position compared to its near abroad than before. And now all of a sudden you get all this like weird stuff about like Islamism and a kind of a neo-Ottoman turn that didn't exist for 100 years in Turkish foreign policy, but now it does because Turkey's way stronger than it used to be. So that would just be like one example of this kind of thing, right? Like, so, and you could extrapolate this on many other countries. And then you get these like big, great powers, and they're really tempted to play missionary, right? They're really tempted to be like, oh, this can't just be about like survival and deal making. Like, we have to be doing something here. And America's particularly, falls for this. Interestingly enough, though, China so far does not. And it's really interesting to see how powerful the Chinese state has become while disavowing a kind of world transforming measure. Like they're really pragmatic so far. I mean, once again, temptations of great power, not saying they'll always be this way, but so far they are doing a really great job keeping their head and being a kind of like pragmatically focused superpower. And I mean, I strongly approve of that. There was once a time where the U.S. actually did behave like that, believe it or not, though it was a very, very, very long time ago. And I do think in the end it's a sliding scale of security, right? The more secure you are, the more you can afford to have ideology impact you. And the longer you're secure, the more ideology will become multi-generational. That's our problem right now. It's hard to break that when it used to change. But if you're a smaller country, you just have to be practical. You just have to do whatever
Yeah.
it takes to keep yourself sovereign.
So on the topic of China, since it's multipolarity, globalization, and the recent rivalry between U.S. on the one hand, U.S. NATO on the one hand, and I guess China BRICS on the other hand, what have you seen? How do you see that developing, and where do you see that going
Yeah, I've always thought
broadly?
like back in the day when people were first talking about this issue, the return, like great power politics are returning, war on terror is over, blah, blah, blah. It was my whole thing. And I like published on this again and again and again. Um, it will not be a Cold War. Like it's just not happening. It lacks there's too many other countries that, while not as powerful as the US and China, are strong enough that they can kind of clear their field, to use an astronomical term, in their immediate neighborhoods to not immediately have to fall into a camp. There's going to be way more equivalent to like non-aligned people, if you will, out in the world. And so what you're going to see is not a Cold War, but a rivalry. Now, this rivalry is still dangerous because it has certain flashpoints. The well-known Taiwan Straits, the less well-known, but I think much more concerning potential of state failure in Pakistan. There's a bunch of places where this kind of thing could touch off. But interestingly enough, after a few years of seeing a lot of China hawk rhetoric, we have seen in Trump's second term a real pull away from that. Like, yes, there's obviously economic nationalism, and they're kind of understanding that like the whole like free trade thing was not maybe the greatest thing ever for the U.S. and China is getting a lot of the blame for that, even though U.S. policymakers enabled it, but whatever. But we're seeing like while the rhetoric is tough, the US seems to, and there's a recent Rand Corporation report that actually goes into detail about this, came out, I think, this week. Um, we're seeing like a pretty strong push, even in the kind of centrist warmonger field, of away from like really ratcheting up with China. I think they're realizing something the Chinese have always realized is if we're the only two countries that can reasonably threaten each other's existence, maybe we shouldn't. Maybe we should be a bit more normal, have a bit more of a restrained rivalry. Now, this could be wishful thinking on my part. You never know what will happen, especially between great powers, and what might touch off a spiral in relations. But it does seem like, as belligerent as the US is in many parts of the world, especially the Middle East, it seems to be kind of, at least for the moment, turning away from belligerence against China. Maybe realizing that it can't do anything else if it does that. It'll have to be all or nothing. Um, this is kind of contrary to the Mearsheimer prediction, right? Which is none of the Mearsheimer says nothing else matters, only rivalry with China matters. So the U.S. establishment seems to be doing almost the opposite. Is if we turn down the China rhetoric and maybe don't focus on China, we can do more elsewhere. Um, I don't
And
know. I don't know where that will go, but I think it's really interesting to see because I think it's important for everyone that these two countries get along. So
Daniel, you had a question about Venezuela?
Yeah, on that note, in fact, so what you were just saying before about what small nations have to do in order to get by, because of the power asymmetries and how they can't afford to be too ideological, I would be curious to hear your thoughts. So it's a big change from China to Venezuela, but Venezuela's been in the news a lot lately, and I would be curious to hear your take on that because, on the one hand, you could look at it in ideological terms, as I think liberals tend to do, and conservatives often too. Like, oh, it's a socialist country, blah, blah, blah. We're gonna, you know, do regime change there because socialism is bad or something like that. But on the other hand, you could look at it from a realist national perspective, and you could say, well, the Maduro regime and before that, Chavez, I mean, they were couching it in this populist socialist rhetoric, but like so many regimes which have called themselves Marxist, what you really have there is an attempt at national liberation or opposition to imperial hegemony. And it's really more of a national resistance type struggle than any kind of ideologically motivated thing. It's about keeping the assets in the hands of the locals instead of being owned and controlled by Blackstone, BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street, whatever. So I would be curious, really, is it what it looks like that's going on in Venezuela, and how is this going to shake out? I mean, on the one hand, the realist view might say, no, that's what's happening here. It's about assets and national resistance to imperial hegemony. On the other hand, a realist might say, come on, guys, you don't have a chance. Cut a deal.
yeah, I think honestly what you're seeing with Venezuela is basically, I think that I think Trump wants their resources. Like it's got more oil than like any country in the world, right? Like Trump wants their resources. Some people that realize that the U.S. can't be a global hegemon anymore want to restore Monroe Doctrine 2.0. They want to, if we only dominate a place, then we're going to dominate the Western Hemisphere. This is, from my perspective, whether one agrees with it or not, this is actually rational, far more rational than the world domination or the Middle East focus or anything like that. I suspect that that is what's really going on, and the kind of weird anti-socialist rhetoric is very much for the Fox News viewers. It is very much, this is the right-wing version of the woke imperium, right? This is the boomer slop, if you will. No, we're freeing the people from, you know, the tyranny of, you know, whatever. So yeah, that's the packaging. That's the packaging to get them whipped up and to get them pro-intervention. But the point of the intervention is the oil. For Venezuela in particular, absolutely 100%. Like that, that is totally the point. The problem, of course, is while that might seem rational, these wars always set off massive refugee crises. I mean, Hillary's intervention, well, Hillary's intervention in Central America, famously started our refugee crisis, you know, our kind of mass immigration issue that led to the rise of Trump. And also our wars in the Middle East did the same thing to Europe, which, you know, would contribute to Brexit and would contribute to kind of the rise of Orban and like stuff like that. So, you know, does Trump want to create his own problem? Like, I mean, if he's all about border security, the last thing he should want is a war in Venezuela. Um, that being said, I mean, maybe he wants to show how tough he is because his long-term plan is to withdraw from other parts of the world and not look like a pussy while he does it. So who knows? Maybe Venezuela is the sacrifice to the hawks so that he can maybe not be a hawk elsewhere. I don't know. I'm just guessing here, but I imagine that it is this is about the oil, and I expect, because Trump is a bully, but he's also kind of like an edging bully, not a physical altercation bully sometimes. There's a possibility that this is kayfabe, right? Like this is all kayfabe to negotiate with Maduro from a position of strength where he'd be willing to give up more. Now, because Rubio's in the government, I don't feel as strongly about that as I do with some of his other kayfabe diplomacy initiatives. I think the threat of a war in Venezuela is probably higher than the threat of war in other parts of the world, from Trump
Because
specifically.
of Rubio.
Because of Rubio, yeah. But fortunately, I can't say that this isn't kayfabe diplomacy, right? It could be that. It could be we're working everyone into a frenzy, and then Maduro says, okay, you want to, you know, buy shares in the oil industry, like, will you leave us alone if we give you that? And then Trump says, sure. I don't know. It's possible.
And you've written about the developments in the Middle East. For example, you wrote a paper about the US's involvement in Iran, and that arguing that there's no way you could affect, you know, the US could affect regime change anymore in Iran. And even if they wanted to, it wouldn't pan out the way they want, the way they would like. So I know we're at time, but maybe as just a last question, can you comment on that, on
Yeah, no,
developments you see in the Middle East?
yeah, I mean, I always see these kind of, I mean, I know we're talking about U.S. foreign policy, but even when we talk about U.S. foreign policy, we shouldn't be too U.S. centric. And so there's a tendency of people to be like, are you for or against regime change? And like with that piece, particularly my unheard piece, my argument was like, that almost doesn't even matter. I mean, yes, regime change is stupid and it fails constantly. But like that's almost secondary importance to like you're ignoring the fact that a change in regime necessarily will change a country's grand strategy. And this is kind of like these are my realist roots reasserting themselves strongly. I'm like, you could topple the mullahs, you know, like you could have a totally different government in Iran, but it wouldn't change Iran's interests. And that's kind of the thing. It might change some of its realignments here and there. It might change its attitude towards Israel, which perhaps that's the point. But it won't change the fact that Iran is a middle power. It wants to dominate countries near it to prevent stronger other middle powers or great powers from invading its neighborhood. it wants to defend itself against, a kind of global machinations of the United States, which has been trying to topple its government since 1979. Um, and so, guess what? If you had a secular government in Iran, what if that secular government actually turned out to be way better at opposing America's objectives? Which I personally think it would be, because there would be no fatwas on weapons of mass destruction, which is actually the secret to keeping America out of your country. Just ask North Korea. And then also, in the inverse, look at Gaddafi, who gave them up, and look what happened to him. So, like, a secular government in Iran might say we can never be humiliated by Israel again. And we are willing to give ourselves nuclear weapons. We are willing to, play dirty in a way that we haven't before to do that. And honestly, like, that's the kind of government in Iran I personally would support, because I think Israel is a destabilization agent, and I don't like theocracy. So it's kind of a great combination. But the point is, it wouldn't matter what it was. Western style liberal democracy, Zoroastrian revival, like return of the Shah, but like not that stupid like fail son that they carved out, but like a more capable one. Anything, communist government in Iran, whatever. Like, it wouldn't matter. It would still be Iran. It occupies the Iranian plateau. It doesn't want a country dominating the Middle East. It will counterbalance against any country that seeks to dominate the Middle East. It will therefore probably never really get along with either Turkey or Israel, no matter what. So, like, the regime change discussion is almost downstream of the fact that, and this is in the future, we at IPD will have research on this. I'm currently working on this. So, look to the Institute for Peace and Diplomacy website in the future, because hopefully we'll have something on this. But these kind of historically rooted civilizational states that are like grounded in these millennia old cultures, they're not going to change because the government changes. Their concept of interest, of space, of near abroad, of balance of power, these are rooted in their historical experience, and their historical experience is rooted in their geography and their resource base, and their material circumstances. And you're not going to change that by toppling a government. And the same thing is going to probably eventually happen if we did topple the government of Maduro. People would still be humiliated by that. Maybe Venezuela has to then play ball with us, but other countries in Latin America will be like, whoa, whoa, wait a second. Are we going back to the Cold War stuff? Like, we don't want that either. And so countries are going to defend their sovereignty against outside imposition, no matter what. And even if it benefits a faction that then rises to power, they're going to want to distance themselves from their patrons in a way, much like we did once with France, by the way. It's not alien to us, to show that they're independent, to show that they have their own sovereignty, and they will not be controlled by a foreign actor. Otherwise, they lack legitimacy in the eyes of their people. So in the end, it really does come down to sovereignty, and Iran is going to be a counterbalancing force to other countries' quest to dominate the region, regardless of what its government looks like. And that's just something that needs to be accepted. And I think once we can, and this will be the argument of our forthcoming paper on the geography of civilizational states, once you accept this long-term planning that particularly older countries have, you understand that you have to come to an arrangement. These different regions have to come with an arrangement to each other, because they are not able, especially in the time of multipolarity, they are not able to just run roughshod over each other. They're not able to determine other people's fates. In the end, the country that is geographically rooted for a long period of time will have its own sense of self and control and sovereignty, and it cannot be
Yeah.
changed by outside actors.
Yeah.
So, I mean, just
Yeah.
get used to dealing with them. That's modus vivendi.
Yeah. Yeah, and the last, if we can ask one last question, the last civilizational, well, the one civilizational, historically rooted state that we didn't get into so far is Russia, and we're really curious to hear your thoughts on the most recent developments in the Russia-Ukraine conflict, and is what you've just said about middle powers and Iran, does that apply to Russia as well?
Yes. Russia is in an interesting place because it's either like the strongest middle power ever or the weakest superpower currently. It's kind of hard to like what exactly is that. I would say it's a regional power that just happens to have the biggest region imaginable. Um, but I think the more important thing is to understand that Russia definitely sees itself as an independent pole. This is one of the reasons why that we at IPD have we kind of prefer the term polycentrism to multipolarity because I think it creates in the mind a more spatially accurate image of like, a geographically rooted kind of places that have a kind of near abroad that they're fixated on. And Russia is kind of like that, right? Like not much to look at as a naval power, but boy, oh boy, if you're one of its neighbors, you have to have some kind of accommodation with it or, woe is you, which is, I think, one of the reasons that Georgia and Ukraine got so severely punished because you flirt with, an outside power and your Russia's near abroad. It's very sensitive to that in the same way that we would be very sensitive if, China formalized an alliance with Venezuela. It would make us very, probably even a bit irrational, you could say. So Russia is trying to do this independent pole thing. Now, the interesting thing is, unlike China, which is very kind of going back on their thousands and thousands of years of, I would say, realist political theory. It's called a different thing there. It's called legalism, but it's there, and honestly it ties in even to Taoist philosophy. They have this tradition of being kind of like relatively non-ideological that they're going back to. Russia, in a weird way, is more like I'm not quite saying it's an inverse America, but it has similarities, right? There is a culture complex in Russia that very much plays to this whole like we're defending Orthodox civilization. It sounds a lot like the people that say that like Israel is the bulwark of like Western civilization kind of stuff. In a way, like Russia wants to be the anti-woke imperium, right? It's like if it wasn't for Russia, everyone would like trans your kids and blah blah blah. Like it's inverted like American progressivism as their foreign policy rationale. Really quite gross and disappointing to see. At the same time, I understand why Russia behaves this way because it is correctly seeing that the era of American hegemony is over and the time is here for other powers to assert themselves. And Russia did not benefit from the American hegemony. It probably suffered more than any country in the world, honestly, especially in the 1990s. So there's a bit of revenge going on. They're doing their own thing. Generally, that's a good thing that countries do their own thing, in my opinion. But I think there's elements in Russia that want to turn it into an ideological project. Now, I'm not saying that that currently runs the government. I do think Putin is much more grounded than his Western critics think he is. But there's a lot of this weird energy on kind of wackier elements of Russian politics that could go somewhere very weird in the future. And in that case, Russia will look like the United States. It won't be that this neo-Hitlerite figure that like American liberals think it is, but it will kind of look like like the inverse John McCain country if it follows that path. And I really don't think it should. I think Russia should learn more from China here.
Yeah, yeah.
And not just be the rebellious, anti-America force in all things. But who knows? I mean, when this war is over, there'll be a lot of war exhaustion in Russia, and they probably won't be jumping at the bit to invade Moldova or whatever. So maybe they will. Maybe this is just a phase. Who knows? And all those
Right.
like weird kind of people with strange tattoos and views on history will fade away, just like the kind of Mayo Petes are kind of fading away now in America. Who knows? I don't know, but it's it's interesting to see. But it is going on an independent path. Is the point? Like Russia for all its excesses, is not making universalistic claims about the world order like the US does. It is acknowledging that there's just a key element of divergence between the fates of countries, which I think, is just acknowledging reality at this point.
And Martin, you had a quick question about Ukraine? Or
Yeah, sure. I just I know you talk about people being, countries being missionaries for democracy or political classes or something. And I just wondered, I've been taken aback by the sort of saber rattling of countries in Western Europe and of the EU, right? The UK, Germany, the EU, France, perhaps, with regard to Ukraine. And so I wondered if, do you think, I heard you say something in another interview, another discussion about um, when people are sort of missionaries for democracy, that this it can sometimes be more extreme when they're not conditioned by the realities of hard power. Use a phrase something like that. And I wondered if you think that's what's going on when you have the UK and Germany and the EU and so on making sort of sounding more aggressive about Ukraine than maybe than the US, at least some of the time. Or is it that they're because they're just geographically closer to connect to things you were saying earlier, and so perhaps more genuinely scared, rightly or wrongly? Or I just wondered what you think about that.
I think it's both. It
Yeah.
is a proximity thing. I mean, I don't begrudge Europeans for being Russia, Ukraine focused right now. If I was the country bordering those nations, I too would prioritize that over other issues. I just think it's ridiculous that so many people in Europe think that everyone outside of Europe has to prioritize this issue too. It would be like the equivalent of someone who lives in the Democratic Republic of Congo being like, well, why don't you prioritize Rwandan foreign policy? Like the narcissistic self-centeredness of the retirement community known as Europe can be extremely ridiculous, especially in a time when not since 1945 has this been the center of anything happening geopolitically. But they have this Victorian hangover that just won't go away. But it is their region, and they are right to be concerned about their region. Absolutely, can't judge them for that. But because of the American security umbrella, I just it does enable some really ridiculous behavior. Like it's like the rhetoric that comes from Germany in particular, I would say, also the Baltic states, just like really crazy stuff. And I mean, leading to a weird domestic realignment too. I mean, what is more baffling to anyone that's ever looked in the past at like a Green Party than the German Green Party? Like, what is that? They're anti-nuclear power, so they're pro-coal, they're pro-war, they are pro-Israel. Like, what? What is this? They're pro-censorship. Like, when I look at figures like Annalena Baerbock, like I'm seeing. I guess maybe my woke Imperium thesis isn't obsolete yet because in Germany it is as strong as it has ever been before. These people are truly the children of this unholy alliance of social progressivism and neoconservatism, and Germany in particular seems to be that nation made manifest. So the Baltics are more understandable because they're right there. You understand why they fear Russia. They probably correctly fear Russia, but they're always like engineering these crises, and they're saying like, oh, like you get the feeling that they want the war to expand so that America will just openly just start fighting on their behalf. It's very, very bizarre. We're talking about countries that have like 5 million people in them each and are not exactly relevant to the global balance of power. So it's a very I mean, I get why it's a big deal for a lot of people, but like, I'm sorry, I live in North America. Like, I will never prioritize the Ukraine on my personal hierarchy. I don't begrudge someone who does because they live close to it. I definitely don't. I understand it, even if you're Kazakhstan, right? You've got a lot of Russians living in the north. You border Russia. That must be terrifying. Like, absolutely. But like, okay, but how is expecting the world to prioritize this issue any weirder than the fact that like Taiwan wants like the EU to defend it? Like that is also strange, like that that makes no sense to me. Like I'm sorry, it's always like neighborhood first. It's always local politics first. It's concentric circles about your location. And I do have a concern though. I do have a concern going forward for all the countries that are involved in this war. Um, even if it's by proxy, perhaps especially if it is. When this war is over, and one day it will be over, one way or the other, and most likely in a situation that is not favorable to Ukraine, I think most people can agree with that. What's going to happen to a lot of these actors in Ukraine? And if they're not allowed to fight Russia anymore, like who are they going to get mad at next? We had this whole thing, in the 1980s called the Mujahideen against the Soviet Union, right? And U.S. arming and equipping them. Those guys ended up as the Taliban and Al Qaeda. What are we going to see come out of Ukraine at the end of the war. You know, we're from the Azov battalion, from a bunch of different actors there who are mad, who are pissed, who have that kind of Freikorps syndrome, if you will, and maybe have international networks, right, with certain foreign activists and whatnot. We're going to see some sketchy stuff, and then people are going to ask our elites, as we once asked them about a certain other group of people. So why were you arming these guys again? What did we get from this? And like, you know, now there's a mafia or a terror network or who knows what going on. And this is going to be a real question. And it's going to be a question for the US, yes, but it'll be even more of a question for the EU. And I really wonder what some of these Ukraine hawk countries in Europe, how much they've thought this through. And maybe the smarter ones say we should keep the war going forever so that those people just fight Russia forever and they never turn on us, because I kind of suspect that they will.
We at Class Unity always like to end on a positive note.
Sorry.
So can you tell us and the audience at home where can they find you online?
Yeah, so I guess I'm not like the world's biggest Twitter user, but I'm on Twitter, or X if you must, on at Christy Mott. I can my most of my publications are on Institute for Peace and Diplomacy, but not all of them. They're kind of spread out around the place. Um, so I keep a publications tab on my personal website, which is called GeoTrickster. It's a WordPress site, but it has a publications tab. If you click on that, it'll have the links to everything I've published that's publicly available. I had to put it somewhere because it really is all over the place. And that's more of a personal site. It won't be like as you know, professional as other things I've written. That's much more goofy. But like, yeah, I keep an e-resume effectively there, and you can find the stuff I've published wherever it could be. Yeah.
Great. And thank you for everyone for coming. Thank you for everyone watching at home. Don't forget to like, subscribe, and let us know what you think in the comments, and consider joining Class Unity or making a donation today. All right. Thanks, Chris.